So CO2 is the chemical term for carbon dioxide, and it's one of the most talked about greenhouse gases. So there are a number of greenhouse gases, which is sometimes shortened to GHG for greenhouse gas. There are a number of greenhouse gases that are produced by various different processes and manufacturing and from industry and released into the atmosphere. These gases have a warming impact on the planet because they create a layer which then traps the heat, and that is why they're called a greenhouse gas. They act like a greenhouse. CO2 is one of the ones that are most talked about because all of the other greenhouse gases are measured in what's called a CO2e, CO2 equivalent. And that means that there's sort of one scale for measuring the sort of impact and the amount of greenhouse gases that are out there. We are aiming to get to net zero, and basically getting to net zero will mean that for all of the greenhouse gases that are released, we are doing the equivalent to take all of those out of the atmosphere. Now, at the moment, the net zero ambition relies on technology that is yet to be developed because we currently can't do that carbon capture and storage. But that is something that we're hoping in years to come that we will solve. So at the moment, people are focused more on carbon neutral, and being carbon neutral means that you're measuring the amount of emissions that you're releasing out into the atmosphere, and you are doing everything you can to limit the amount of emissions that you're releasing. But as well as that, in addition to that, you are offsetting that carbon. So at the moment, companies that are carbon neutral will be doing everything they can to reduce their emissions, but they'll also be doing some offsetting activity to balance out that carbon that they know they're emitting and they can't reduce down any further. Scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are directly created by your business. So an example of that would be the fuel being burnt in the vehicles that you operate. If you have a fleet of vans, like we do at Geo Green, that's a big contributor to our Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are the emissions related to generating the energy that you then buy in. So we aren't generating our own electricity at Geo Green, or we are actually because we've got some solar panels on the roof, but some of the energy that we buy in from the grid, we're not generating ourselves, but it's coming from a power station that potentially will be using a fossil fuel like gas to generate that electricity. Scope 3 emissions are everything else, and they sort of fall into two Scope 3 buckets. So there are your upstream Scope 3 emissions, so the things which are emissions that are related to things that you're potentially buying in your supply chain. So if you're buying in components that are being manufactured elsewhere, the emissions related to that manufacturing will be upstream Scope 3. And then there's also downstream Scope 3, which are the emissions related to the products and services that you then deliver out into your supply chain in the other direction. So something like a car manufacturer or car sales room, for example, their Scope 3 would have to factor in the fact that that car was now going to be on the road, potentially using fossil fuel in terms of being able to drive around.